Hello everyone, and welcome to the remastered and updated 50-second episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Baron Vladimir Harkonnen from Dune. Well, Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 2 has just come out at the time of making this video, and it's proven to be a fantastic film that is certainly in the conversation when discussing the greatest films ever made. So I figured now would be the proper time to delve back into the Duneverse to discuss some Harkonnen villainy. Now, some of you might be asking why I've chosen to remaster the Baron episode instead of create some new ones on, say, Fade and Raban, two other Harkonnen baddies who deserve to be covered in their own right. Well, I'm actually going to do just that, but in the wake of the release of Dune Part 2, I figured now would be the best time to update that episode on the main Harkonnen villain to include what we were given on the Baron in that film, and touch up this episode with a few things that I neglected to include last time around, before moving on to cover his nephews. So in the coming days and weeks, alongside the other episodes I have scheduled for this month, expect to see two separate videos on both Raban and Fade gracing your video feeds. But aside from giving me the opportunity to cover a trio of intriguing villains, these Harkonnen videos also serve as a vessel for you all to tell me how interested you are in seeing more Dune-related content, and there are some things in particular I think you all might be interested in seeing. To help me out with this, I've made individual comments down below, suggesting each of the following options, and I'd like the rest of you to like those comments so we can keep them towards the top of the comment section, and comment with your interest on these topics so I can get a better idea of whether or not you'd like to see these things, and perhaps some things that I hadn't thought about covering. So I could make an episode on Paul Atreides, the prophetic hero of our story whose actions in the sequels are morally questionable to say the least. But considering that Villeneuve seems like he's going to make film adaptations of the sequels, perhaps let me know whether or not you'd like that video sometime in the near future, or when those films are released. I could make an episode on Emperor Shaddam IV, and the general machinations of House Carino after their abdication of the throne that we see unfolding in the sequels. I could also make an episode on Paul's son, Leto Atreides II, who ruled the empire his father left behind for a grand total of 3,500 years, as a human-sandworm hybrid, whose actions are also morally questionable. I could also make an episode, or separate episodes, on the various morally questionable organizations that have a part in deciding the course of events in this universe, namely the Landsraad, CO.AG, the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, the Bene Tialax, or the Honored Maiders. The last thing I had in mind for a video topic would be coverage of the prequels and the sequels made by Frank Herbert's son, Brian Herbert, and Kevin J. Anderson. Because I didn't really see too much interest in the last video in exploring the prequels and sequels, I'm not going to go into those versions of the story in this video, or the Raban and Fade videos either, mostly due to the fact that these books have quite the mixed reception, and I'd like to make sure I give you the untainted versions of these characters, so to speak. However, I've seen some pretty interesting stuff in those books despite their downfalls, and well, if you don't want to bother reading all those books to suffer said downfalls, you could always make me do it for you, and I can regale you with all the details in video form. And for every video I make covering the main series, I'd make a companion video for each covering all the information for that character or organization that we receive in those stories. So that's what I had in mind as far as Dune videos go, and whether or not I actually make them is dependent on your input. So again, check out the comments down below to show your support for each of these topics. Alright, so in this video, we'll be exploring everything we're given about the Baron in the Dune novel, while we compare the source material to the three versions of this character we've been given, those being Kenneth Macmillan's portrayal in the 1984 film, Ian McNeece's in the 2000 miniseries, and Stellan Skarsgård's in the new two-part film, each of which have varying degrees of accuracy. And we'll be discussing how they differ from the source material at several points in this video. Now, I mentioned back when I made the original episode that the miniseries version of the Baron was the truest adaptation of the first book that we'd been given yet. And after the release of Dune Part 2, it turns out that's still the case in certain ways, especially as far as the Baron's character is concerned. While that might be true, that doesn't mean that the miniseries is the superior experience. Far from it, in fact, as it's as campy as you'd expect an early 2000s sci-fi show to be. And as of the making of this video, I'm sure most if not all of you who have seen Dune Part 1 and 2 will agree that it's the definitive visual adaptation of Frank Herbert's masterpiece of a novel. That being said, if you'd like to see either a mostly accurate representation of the book Baron, or a completely off-the-walls grotesque and insane version of him, it's still worth giving both the miniseries and the David Lynch film a watch, and you can actually watch the miniseries here on YouTube, a link to which I'll provide down in the description. Also, just so you're aware, I won't be mentioning the Baron's appearance in Children of Dune in this video, as I'd rather wait for the potential sequels of the new film to be released before mentioning how he's portrayed there, and if they do include him, I'll be sure to make a separate video discussing those films when the time is right. I know this has been a lengthy introduction, but before we get going, we should first talk about our sponsor for this video, Aura. Living in this increasingly digital world of ours always comes with risks. And those spam emails and robocalls can be annoying, they're actually a symptom of a much bigger problem: data brokerage. Data brokers find their way to your personal information and sell it to spammers and scammers who then bombard you with unwanted emails, text messages, and phone calls. And worse still, they can even steal your identity. A quick Google search of your name can tell you just how easy it is for someone to get a hold of your information. And I was definitely concerned when I did so myself and learned just how many results pop up when I enter my information. Luckily, Aura has already started working on my behalf to get rid of any data brokers who've gotten hold of my information. And by looking through my data vault, I can see that they found 16 companies who currently have my information and are selling that information to malefactors looking to make my life miserable and expose me to hackers. That's not all though. Aura also offers other features like a VPN, antivirus, password management, parental controls, and identity theft insurance, all in one convenient app. And it's easy to set up and affordable too. You likely already have some of these products protecting you, but with Aura always on, and all of these things conveniently located in one app, you'll find yourself gaining that added and effortless protection in your digital life that all of us need. I value my privacy, and I value yours. And you can go to aura.com/thevileeye, or click the link down in the description to start protecting yourself with a 2-week free trial of Aura today. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring this video. Now without further ado, let's begin. At the time the story of Dune begins, enmity between House Harkonnen and House Atreides had existed for over 300 generations, a fact that in part decided the fate of Vladimir Harkonnen before he was even born. 10,198 years before Vladimir's birth in 88 BG, that is before the Guild monopolized space travel, House Carino cemented their position as rulers of the known universe following the Battle of Corin, which we can assume was fought between House Carino and the other houses vying for supremacy during the immediate aftermath of the Butlerian Jihad, a war against thinking machines like computers that had concluded 20 years prior to this battle, and birthed the orders of the Mentats, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, so humanity might replace through human power the technology that was now forbidden to them. During said battle, Vladimir's ancestor and possible founder of House Harkonnen, Bashar Abulard Harkonnen, was accused of treachery by House Atreides, and was banished for his cowardice after the battle had concluded. Over the next 10,000 plus years, House Harkonnen would claw its way out of obscurity and exile through manipulation of the whale fur market, eventually reaching a point of prestige amongst the great houses. This caused Emperor Elrond Carino IX, father of Shaddam Carino IV, to promote Vladimir's father to planetary governor of Arrakis a year after Vladimir's birth in the year 10,111 AG. While we don't know much about the reign of his father, or his early reign as Baron, we can assume that Vladimir ascended to the barony somewhat early on in his life, as I'm sure a man as cunning and conniving as Vladimir Harkonnen would have taken any opportunity to supplant his father as Baron at the proper time. And once he did, he found himself lord of a house who was on its way to becoming the most wealthy and powerful house in the Imperium, second only to the Imperial House of Carino. And with the profits rolling in from their control of Arrakis and the spice trade, and careful plotting on the part of the Baron, by the time the story of Dune begins, they have accomplished just that. No matter when he became Baron, or how he propelled his family to the heights of power though, it's said that the people of Arrakis grew to fear the Harkonnens from the moment they were granted the desert planet as their fief. And considering their ill reputation with House Atreides, we can assume that Vladimir being the villain he is isn't an anomaly, but a time-honored tradition of House Harkonnen that's been encouraged in their family for centuries. However, the penultimate Baron of House Harkonnen may just have been the culmination of centuries of vile Harkonnen culture, and he is without a doubt the greatest representation of the dread practices and ideals of this oft-reviled noble house. From the very moment we're introduced to the Baron in the book, he comes off as a power-hungry and greedy egotist, as we find him classically flaunting his plans for Arrakis and the Atreides in front of his twisted mentat, Piter de Veers, and his nephew Feyd-Rautha. It was a relief globe of a world, partly in shadows, spinning under the impetus of a fat hand that glittered with rings. The globe sat on a freeform stand at one wall of a windowless room, whose other walls presented a patchwork of multicolored scrolls, film books, tapes, and reels. Light glowed in the room from golden balls hanging in mobile suspensor fields. An ellipsoid desk with a top of jade-pink petrified Alaka wood stood at the center of the room. Variform suspensor chairs ringed it, 2 of them occupied. In one sat a dark-haired youth of about 16 years, round of face, and with sullen eyes. The other held a slender, short man with a feminine face. Both youth and man stared at the globe and the man half hidden in shadows spinning it. A chuckle sounded beside the globe. A basso voice rumbled out of the chuckle. "There it is, Piter, the biggest man-trap in all history, and the Duke's headed into its jaws. Is it not a magnificent thing that I, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, do?" "Assuredly, Baron," said the man. His voice came out tenor with a sweet musical quality. The fat hand descended onto the globe, stopped the spinning. Now, all eyes in the room could focus on the motionless surface and see that it was the kind of globe made for wealthy collectors or planetary governors of the Empire. It had the stamp of imperial handicraft about it. Latitude and longitude lines were laid in with hair-fine platinum wire. The polar caps were insets of finest cloud milk diamonds. The fat hand moved, tracing details on the surface. "I invite you to observe," the basso voice rumbled. "Observe closely, Piter, and you too, Feyd-Rautha. rather, my darling. From 60 degrees north to 70 degrees south, these exquisite ripples. Their coloring, does it not remind you of sweet caramels? And nowhere do you see blue of lakes, or rivers, or seas. And these lovely polar caps, so small, could anyone mistake this place? Arrakis, truly unique, a superb setting for a unique victory. Now, the most defining physical trait of Baron Harkonnen in all his variations is without a doubt his obesity, a trait of his which is the result of uncontrolled gluttony. But it's interesting to note that the Baron imagines himself as a man of control, as during this conversation with Piter and Fade, the Baron and Piter argue back and forth about several key elements of the Baron's plot. And when Fade grows impatient with this arguing, expressing said impatience with an outburst, the Baron responds by stating that Fade aspires to rule his barony, yet he cannot rule himself. When you consider this as coming from a man whose physicality indicates that he also has an inability to rule himself, this might seem like quite the hypocritical statement. However, the Baron is specifically speaking about emotions here. As though he might not be able to put down the fork, he's certainly well composed and put together on an emotional level, as a man who has plans as far-reaching and devious as Baron Harkonnen must inherently have control of himself on a mental and emotional level. Despite this, in private, the Baron is egotistical and self-absorbed, as I've already mentioned, and while much of that seems to be derived from his high opinion of himself and his capabilities as a manipulative ruler, we have to consider that these traits often manifest in members of royalty or nobility due to their literal status as important people in their respective societies, a corrupting influence that has filled many a person with delusions of grandeur. And such is the case with the Baron, for along with his ego and his pride in the achievements he has garnered, comes a heightened sense of pride in his lineage and the accomplishments of his house. And the Baron is a man who has an overwhelming sense of self-importance, putting himself on a pedestal as a great and powerful man, the magnificent and ingenious ruler of the greatest clan in the known universe, a claim which actually isn't unwarranted, as he is indeed powerful, holding in his hands the resources of a great house that has been shoring up its wealth for nearly a century through its domination of the spice trade and proximity to the imperial household. We find that the Baron is prone to talking down to his subordinates while highlighting his own grandeur, pointing out their faults and shortcomings in comparison to his own cunning, but recognizing their strengths and utilizing them appropriately. However, the Baron isn't exactly boastful, and he in fact becomes inwardly angry with himself for boasting to Raban at one point in the novel. But he does enjoy gloating, and he derives exquisite pleasure from besting his opponents and shoving their failures in their faces. Though the Baron does have a massive ego, because he only displays it privately, it doesn't do him much harm, as he's a cautious and slightly paranoid pragmatist, one who utilizes manipulation, advanced planning, and an understanding of human desire to achieve his goals. And the greatest example of the Baron's intellect can be found in how the Baron has put himself and his house in a position to realize their dream of ridding themselves of their rivals, the Atreides, and securing unlimited wealth and the throne of the Imperium for himself and his heir. And all of who the Baron is, and what he's become as a result of his rearing as a scion of House Harkonnen, resulted in a plan that was nothing short of masterful. For some time, the Emperor had been fearful of House Atreides and their growing power, and knowing this, the Baron had likely whispered into the Emperor's ear for many years, promising him that his power could be secured, while his hands remained clean in the process, with the help of the noble and most loyal Baron. To do this, the Baron has taken measures to ensure that the Atreides are greeted by sabotage and uprising on Arrakis, buildings and machinery stripped of their usefulness, and settlements sent into an uproar to distract the Atreides from the true intention of the Harkonnens. Not only that, but he's placed spies amongst their ranks, as well as an assassin that had been planted in the Atreides' new residence prior to their arrival, one that was sent to kill Duke Leto's heir, and cause further disruption in his house before the Baron unleashed his masterstroke. From here, the Baron, with the help of 3 battalions of dreaded Sardaukar disguised as Harkonnen troops, swiftly invaded Arrakis with an overwhelming force, a force that would be aided by the cornerstone of this plan, the cultivation of a traitor in Dr. Yue to place amongst the ranks of the Atreides, a traitor whom the Baron turned to his cause by holding the wife of Dr. Yue hostage, or so Yue thinks, in order to persuade the doctor to betray his masters in exchange for her freedom. And it was Yue's incapacitation of Leto and his family that ensured the Baron could eliminate his rival without having to wonder whether or not they had escaped in the chaos of his invasion. Though this act would still have its repercussions, seeing as how the doctor enables Duke Leto to endanger the Baron's life, the Baron approaches his handling of this situation with the utmost caution, having Piter dispose of the doctor once he served his purpose, or in the latest films, doing so himself by brutally cutting Yue's head off, citing that he can't ever bring himself to trust a traitor, even one that he's cultivated himself. The Baron also planned to ensure that the other houses knew that it was he who brought down House Atreides, which further highlights the Baron's cunning, as he recognizes the necessity of the lesser houses knowing that it was he who brought down the Duke, knowing that he needs to instill fear into the other nobles in order to secure his position. Following his reappearance attainment of Arrakis, the Baron planned to have Piter rule over it as Duke, anticipating that he would utterly subjugate its populace and further their hatred for the already reviled House Harkonnen, a position that's taken by his nephew Raban after Piter's demise. After a sufficient amount of suffering had been inflicted upon the people of Arrakis, the Baron planned to install his nephew Feyd-Rautha as Duke, painting him as the valiant savior who would put a stop to the suffering of the people and allow him to garner a reputation as a valiant and noble youth who could one day assume the throne of the entire Imperium by marrying one of the Emperor's daughters, becoming the son he never had. In the Villeneuve adaptation, this part of the plan plays out a bit differently, as rather than expressing that it's Piter or Raban's job to pave the way for Feyd, Raban is instead the one who takes over Arrakis, without any mention of Piter doing so. And it's after some time when Raban fails to subjugate the Fremen that the Baron decides to have Feyd take over for him. So not quite as devious, but it is rather brutal the way he casts aside Raban in favor of Feyd. Now this is quite the complex and well thought out plan, but by sifting through the particulars of the Baron's plot, we can discern ever more important details about his character. One thing about the Baron's character that may surprise some of you is how his pragmatic mindset gives him the capability to understand that violence should be used sparingly, as well as the fact that violence is one thing that the Baron doesn't necessarily derive pleasure from. In the introductory conversation between the Baron, Feyd, and Piter that we discussed earlier, he cites Piter's pleasure in committing violent acts as concerning, and during that same exchange, he actually expresses his pity for Duke Leto, as he knows that the plan he's concocted, and the Duke's knowledge of that plan's particulars, will undoubtedly be a terrible realization that the Baron can find sympathy for. The Baron shows himself for a certainty to not be a sadist here either, as he explains that he inflicts pain out of necessity, and just because this is how his plan must be carried out, that doesn't mean that he has to like it. Later on, he even expresses his reluctance to torture Duke Leto, partially because he doesn't enjoy violence, but also because he knows if he tortures him, that it could set a violent precedent, one that would show that the nobility can be harmed in such a cruel way, a cruelty that the Baron envisions coming back to bite him in the future, which is a notion that only further highlights the pragmatic nature of his mind. Even in his request for his nephew to subjugate the people of Arrakis, he advises him to crush its people into submission rather than wipe them out, as if he completely exterminated the populace of Arrakis, who would be left to toil for the Baron and provide him with income. There are several instances in the novel where the Baron makes threats of violence or orders violent acts to be carried out though, particularly when he's angered or frustrated, like when Feyd makes an attempt on his life and he orders his co-conspirator, a slave master, and the slave girls Feyd enjoyed, to be executed. And his film adaptations seem to have no qualms about committing violent acts. And while the Denis Villeneuve version isn't what you would call a sadist, he does kill Dr. Yue himself rather than having Piter do so, orders Raban to kill all the Fremen when he's asking him to rule over Arrakis, and he also kills 3 of his bathing attendants in a fit of rage when things aren't going according to plan on Arrakis. But the David Lynch version actually does seem to be a sadist, maniacally reveling in the suffering of others, and even taking out one of the bizarre heart plugs of one of his slave boys that all the Harkonnens seem to wear in this film, which is pretty on point for this version of the Baron, as unhinged would probably be the best way to describe him. Now, though the Baron has far-reaching and intricate plans in place to secure his family's position, the Baron is well aware that none of his machinations would be possible without the resources to accomplish his plans, and there is no resource more important to any other plan than manpower. Some leaders inspire loyalty, a sense of duty, or a common cause to be championed within their subjects, and those leaders are oft beloved and venerated as noble, just, and righteous. But then there are leaders like Baron Harkonnen, leaders who control their hordes of minions through fear, violence, and keen manipulation of their desires. The Baron is a man who inspires little to no love from his people, but the Baron is wealthy, and his wealth enables him to prey on the greed and vices of his various minions. He promises Piter Lady Jessica as a plaything once they've taken Arrakis, and later offers him the dukedom of Arrakis in exchange for his continued services, all the while holding his other pleasures above his head like his addiction to spice as leverage. He entices Feyd-Rautha with the promise of one day inheriting his position, and sometime later, when Feyd is conspiring against him, he assures Feyd that if he keeps his uncle living, that he can help him achieve a greater power, the throne of the Empire. It would also seem that the Baron is fond of testing his subordinates, as when Feyd is fighting in the arena, rather than sending Feyd a drugged fighter as usual, he sends in a former Atreides soldier, who's completely lucid, which would have accomplished one of 2 things. Either Feyd would prove himself, or the Baron would lose an unworthy heir, which serves to further enhance the devious nature of Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. When he recruits a new captain of his guard, Nefud, he ensures that this man will be loyal by using his knowledge of his addiction to samuta, a type of drug, to entice him, assuring him that he'll never want for his precious drug again should he remain a faithful member of his entourage. In the aftermath of the invasion of Arrakis, he persuades the Atreides Mentat, Thufir Hawat, to join his forces by promising him a place in his ranks, a purpose with a superior master who allows Hawat to operate at maximum efficiency now that he's not limited by an inferior duke, and the Bene Gesserit witch that he believes ruined all he stood for, as something that's missing in the new film, and and in the 1984 film as well, is a plotline where Hawat suspects that Jessica is responsible for the downfall of House Atreides, and it's this belief that pushes Hawat to join the Baron once he's captured by him after the invasion. But underscoring all of these promises is an even greater promise, the promise that if anyone should betray the Baron, there is always someone else caught in his golden web who's ready to do his bidding and dispose of any treachery among his ranks. And every promise the Baron makes to his people is always made with his own interests in mind. Piter was going to be used to subjugate Arrakis, to pave the way for Feyd to come in as its savior, as we've already discussed, and the Baron was ready to do the same thing with Raban, and cast him aside once he'd outlived his usefulness. Feyd was his heir presumptive, who would realize his dream of having a Harkonnen on the throne. Nefud carried out the Baron's dirty work, and Hawat was widely known as one of the greatest mentats in the known universe, who could assist the Baron in furthering his position. And the Baron made sure he would do so by poisoning him and continuously supplying the antidote to him in his food, something that the Baron was more than ready to take away if he needed to. However, his subordinates do learn from his behavior, and none are particularly loyal to him. Piter and Raban both expressed disdain for their uncle and hint at possibly murdering him at some point. Nefud is only loyal to the Baron because he's dependent on the Baron supplying him with his chosen drug. Hawat is only loyal because of the poison, but also because he believes he can seek out his revenge at some point by allying himself with the Baron. But Feyd turns out to be the most treacherous of all, as in the novel as well as the miniseries. He attempts to end the Baron's life by playing on the Baron's own desires, planting a poisonous needle in the thigh of a slave boy the Baron enjoyed, highlighting how the treacherous behavior of the Baron isn't without its repercussions, no matter how pragmatic a person may be. And it should also be noted that the Baron often finds himself in a disadvantageous position due to the bumbling efforts of his incompetent subordinates, an unfortunate byproduct of employing morally corrupt henchmen who are chosen for their respective jobs not because they're necessarily qualified for them, but because they'll do whatever the Baron says so long as they too get what they want. Though the Baron will provide people useful to him with wealth and security, it would seem that the people he rules over receive no such comfort, as during a ceremony on Gadi Prime to confirm Feyd as his heir, the Countess Fenring observes that the capital, Harko, is filthy and in disrepair, which indicates that the Baron hoards his wealth, just as he hoards food, sharing little with others unless he absolutely has to, which only serves to highlight his immense greed. And further evidence for this can be found in the fact that the people who have gathered to celebrate Feyd's birthday celebration in the fighting arena were forced to attend, and in order to placate them afterwards, the Baron organizes a festival to keep them distracted from the terrible reality of their lives under the Harkonnens. Again, in the newest film, this event is portrayed in a much different light, both literally and figuratively, as it would seem that the people of Gadi Prime are actually quite enthusiastic about their rulers, which is something we'll discuss a little more later on. Now, why is the Baron so adept at manipulating people through their desires? Because the Baron doesn't just understand human desire, the Baron is human desire, human want made flesh. The Baron may not be a sadist, but he is a grossly overindulgent hedonist, and the Baron's desires are what fuel every action he takes. He's pursuing greater wealth for his house in order to provide himself with a limitless well from which he can draw his deepest desires from without restraint. He's warring against his enemies to secure this wealth, but also because it serves to enhance his own power, a power that he enjoys taking just as much as he enjoys having it. As whereas the Baron doesn't enjoy violence on a carnal level, he is a cunning tactician, and he enjoys the plotting and scheming that come along with a good malicious plan, reveling at the thought of his forces overcoming his enemy due to his own intelligence. And he absolutely enjoys the political maneuvering he must employ in order to get the better of his enemies, which he's quite adept at, considering he's managed to so effectively place himself adjacent to the royal court. Though we have no knowledge of the Baron enjoying drugs or alcohol, save for in the newest film, where he's seen smoking a hookah-like contraption, his other vices more than compensate for a lack of addiction to mind-altering substances, and the Baron has an intense addiction to food, one that has caused him to reach 200 kilos, or 440 pounds, a burden that requires him to use suspensors to help him walk. In the book, he does indeed walk, but in the films and the TV series, he's portrayed as either being too lazy, and he instead floats to move around. Perhaps the most revolting aspect of the Baron, though, are his pederastic sexual desires. The Baron appears to be gay, or at the very least bisexual, as he did father Lady Jessica when he was sampling many different things in his youth. But aside from that one encounter, we're given no indication that he engages in any sort of traditional romantic relationships. Instead, the Baron preys on young teenage boys, specifically slave boys who he abuses against their will, for his own satisfaction, and he even expresses his admiration for his nephew's body several times, showing us that he likely has no qualms about engaging in incestual relations if it suits him. After disposing of Duke Leto, he even goes so far as to request a specific slave that looks like Paul to be brought to his chambers drugged, so he doesn't have to bother wrestling with him. And considering that Paul is 15 at the time he makes such a request, that should give you a clear enough idea of what sort of heinous depravity that the Baron regularly engages in. One thing to note here though, and something that I wasn't aware of in the previous video, is that Frank Herbert was decidedly homophobic, and though it's never been confirmed, it's more than likely that the Baron is gay because Frank Herbert considered homosexuality to be immoral. Thus the most immoral character in his story is a homosexual. That's definitely not okay, and being gay isn't evil or immoral, but seeing as how preying on young adults is meant to reflect the abhorrent debauchery of his character, which is evil no matter your sexuality, I feel I must include this aspect of his character in this video. This component of the Baron is absent from the newest films, but it is present in the David Lynch film somewhat, as the Baron does murder a young boy in a rather sensual manner, and what we're given in the novel as far as this aspect of his character is concerned is very much present in the miniseries. Aside from what I've already mentioned, all of what we've discussed so far regarding the Baron's personality and machinations are more or less present in each iteration of his character. But now we need to discuss the biggest differences between all 4 iterations: his outward personality, appearance, and mannerisms. In the book, the way the Baron speaks or acts isn't described in detail all too much, but he is said to have a basso voice, and his choice of words indicates that he's pompous, conniving, and facetious, and he speaks to people in a sickeningly affectionate way, often referring to people as "my dear so-and-so." The way he moves is obviously sluggish and awkward, and when he walks, he's described as performing an odd mixture of waddling and gliding. He does have a tenderness to him, caressing objects or himself when he speaks, a compulsive touching highlighting his movements. But other than that, the obese Baron isn't a man who is prone to moving much. Other than being extremely overweight, the Baron is described in the books as looking baby-like in his features, with chubby cheeks and fat hands reminiscent of a newborn, and he wears multiple different types of finery, adorning his hands and clothing with jewels of many extravagant colors. In the Denis Villeneuve adaptation, we receive a more muted version of the Baron, one who's clad in plain clothing and who has his suspensors grafted to his spine. His smooth features not quite baby-like, but certainly close, and the oversized robes he seems to be fond of wearing adds to the enormity of his already enormous frame, especially when he's floating. This Baron is neither tender nor condescending. Instead, he's more so haughty and reserved, speaking little and projecting a much more menacing aura. One of the primary characteristics of not just the Baron, but all Harkonnens in this version of the story, is the fact that they're all bald and hairless, which is expanded on in Part 2 when we learn that the reason for this is because Gedi Prime is a world that's shrouded in the monochromatic light of a black sun, and as the muted ruler of a muted world, the Baron and his people appear as almost alien-like creatures who seem to be more akin to orcs than anything. And though this version of the Baron is only slightly similar to his book counterpart in appearance and personality, his understated persona and casual villainy come across as a menacing extension of his people, a people who seem to be thoroughly shrouded in darkness. And this version of the character, while still a political maneuverer and a manipulator, seems in many respects to be more so a Dark Lord, ruling over a horde of evil minions. The David Lynch version of the character is the exact opposite, as he is much more over the top and maniacal, his depravity manifesting more outwardly in his devious cackling and his erratic wide-eyed movements and speech. The Baron here appears with a shock of red hair on a sweat-covered balding head that's riddled in pustules and blisters, an infectious manifestation of the rot that festers within his soul. In this rendition, he wears no finery whatsoever, instead opting to wear a leather trench coat over the odd suspensor contraption that surrounds his body. The miniseries Baron is the most decadent of them all, appearing as more of a classic nobleman who's clad in red luxurious clothing. This Baron has a full head of red hair and a much more composed and smug demeanor, and he's also prone to rhyming and the self-satisfied and grandiose manner of speaking that we would come to expect of the Baron we see in the book. But he does differ in his delivery and his mannerisms, being much more dramatic and mobile than his literary counterpart, and he's almost Shakespearean in the way he's presented to us. However, none of these differences matter too much in the end, as save for the newest version of the Baron, who meets his end at Paul's hand, they all meet their deaths at the hands of Alia Atreides, the granddaughter he never knew he had, from a family he was closer to than he could have ever imagined. A knife in the dark that the Baron's planning could not account for. Despite his careful planning and Machiavellian maneuvering, the Baron had a fatal flaw in his character that ensured that this moment was an inevitability, his self-assuredness that led him to underestimating his subordinates and his enemies. There are a few times in the novel where the Baron is surprised at the intelligence of his nephews, or of his minions like Nefud, and just like with those closest to him, the Baron underestimated the power of the Fremen, writing them off as a population of savages, whose numbers weren't more than that of a few thousand. And because he was so sure of himself, and so sure of everything else around him, everything that he ignored slowly built up until they became strong enough to encompass his downfall. The Baron was a man who was off secure in a far-off palace, ordering horrendous actions to be done, but never taking a large part in the fulfillment of those actions. So whether or not it was the Blade of Alia and the machinations of the prophesied Kwisatz Haderach, an inevitable Fremen resistance numbering somewhere in the millions, or a knife in the back from those closest to him, the Baron Harkonnen, who had made evil his business, was always destined to fall to some extension of that very same evil, whether that be through the people he wronged or the seedy elements that he had surrounded himself with. So in the end, who was Baron Vladimir Harkonnen? He was a thoroughly hedonistic and overindulgent man with immense planetary power at his disposal, one who sought to supplant the powers that be and place himself and his family at the heights of imperial power. In his quest to see this dream realized, the Baron employed every underhanded tactic in the book you can imagine: manipulation, sabotage, subterfuge, intimidation, torture, murder, and surprise military action, all for the benefit of a few people, chief among them himself. He's a gross representation of what terrible things a terrible man can do when he has access to immense power and wealth, the embodiment of a self-serving hedonist who sees only what he wants and what the people around him can do to satisfy those wants. Cruel, gluttonous, and greedy, Baron Harkonnen was a man whose ambitions lay solely in satisfying his own desires, a man who took advantage of who knows how many lives and ended who knows how many countless more, a thoroughly repugnant and abhorrent man who was as rotten as the system he was a part of, and a man whose abundance of corpulent flesh hid a malignant and calculating evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on the Baron? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, and anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.